Good morning readers, welcome to another Bookish Breakfast and welcome to a whole new bookshelf. So this room, when we moved in, it had textured wallpapers that had like flowers and little circles all over it, and it had a green carpet with pink flowers all over it, and it has now been over a year since we moved in, and finally we have managed to turn it into a really nice room. Actually, it's now the nicest room in the house. No textured wallpaper, there's like a nice grey carpet, there's no curtains at the moment, so it probably sounds a little bit echoey, but you know, one step at a time. And now there's a new bookshelf as well. So we've got all mixed together, kind of alphabetically organised. We've got poetry, plays, short stories and mythology all on this shelf to make a bit more space on the like fantasy and general fiction bookshelves that we have downstairs. Yeah, we're turning the house gradually into a library, categorising it like you would probably categorise a library as we go along. But it's all good fun. It's not actually a bookshelf, it's a Welsh dresser that used to belong to Beau's mum, and she was getting rid of it to like get some more modern furniture, and I just love old wooden furniture and so does Beau. So yeah, we wound up with it and decided to put it in our spare bedroom because that's a perfectly natural place to put a Welsh dresser in. Apologies for the dressing gown this morning. It's really cold. It's so cold that I actually had a dream about whether I should buy a blanket or a jumper, because I was obviously cold in my sleep, and when I got up I was cold, so I just couldn't let go of it this morning. And I'm heading into work shortly, so I'm going to try and be relatively brief. So about books. It's still Victober, but I don't have that much Victober type stuff to share with you, really. So I've mostly been reading non-fiction because of my course and because of some of the books that I've been lent, but I will get to that. So I've read a little bit more of Humanitarian Negotiations Reveal the MSF Experience, which is edited by Magone, Neuman and Weissman. That's been really interesting. So I was reading a bit about the healthcare system in France, and I think the chapter's called Managing the Undesirables. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to find it. And it talks about like how MSF has acted in a country like France, which is seen as being, well, it is a higher income country, in order to ensure access to healthcare for some of those that have been traditionally excluded from healthcare, particularly focusing on migrants later on. Earlier in the process, it was more of a general groups of vulnerable populations, but then they came to focus more on migrants, which obviously has interest and relevance for me, so I've enjoyed that chapter. Then I've been reading the new Odyssey by Kingsley. This is one of those books that I just leave lying around, and every time I'm in that room I read a chunk more, and I'm actually over halfway through. So this was a library book. I got it from my nearest university library, as opposed to the university library of the university that I'm currently attending, if that makes any sense whatsoever. And Patrick Kingsley is a Guardian journalist. He is their migration correspondent, which apparently was a new position that they appointed him into just before the big wave of what is called the migrant crisis in like journalistic terms or political terms, I suppose, but just before the increasing attention paid to, sorry, that's Beau's alarm, to people moving into Europe from the north of Africa and from Turkey. So he was very well placed to go and interview loads of different people. And it's really interesting. He talks about different places that he's been to, people that he's interviewed everywhere. He's been everywhere from the Sahara to Turkey to Greece so far. But he also follows the specific story of one man who he has called Hisham, who I think is a real man that he actually met at various points on his journey. So that gives the book a kind of a narrative as well. So that's enjoyable, and it's helping to put the kind of the context of the years around 2015 into perspective for me. I'm really, really enjoying just the clarity and the depth of his writing. It's really good quality. So I would recommend this one. Then the non-fiction book that I read a little section from last week when I did the 112 Victober thing, I just wanted to throw it in because I loved it so much, is This Is Going to Hurt by Adam Kay. This one I think has been pretty much a bestseller since it came out. Like, people have been really enjoying it since it came out, and for good reason. For the majority of the book, it is hysterically funny and just very, very representative of life inside an NHS hospital. I don't want to say too much more about how it associates with my work, but one of my colleagues says that this should be recommended reading for all of our family and friends, and I'm trying to persuade Bo to read it at the moment. I read it between nights and just got through it straight away, even though I should probably have been asleep. So that's This Is Going to Hurt. Then one of my colleagues, so this was lent to me by one of my colleagues who's also a really big reader, and she also very kindly lent me 2 other books. When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. If you've not heard of this book, Paul Kalanithi was a trainee neurosurgeon who sadly was diagnosed with, I think it was a lung tumour, and has subsequently passed away. But before he became a doctor, he was, I think, a student of literature, so he just used his his literature background to turn his experiences into a book. Everyone has said that it is very, very moving and very, very interesting and very, very well written. I have so far just read the prologue, and the prologue doesn't really meet those criteria, but not the prologue, sorry, the foreword, but that was written by, I think, a colleague or a friend of his. Actually, he says in the prologue, Abraham Verghese, that he only met Paul Kalanithi once, but for some reason he was the person who was writing the prologue, the foreword for this book. So that's that one. We'll be getting to that one at some point. And then she also lent me Ebola Behind the Mask, which apparently was by Andy Dennis and Anna Simon. Andy Dennis is an MSF nurse, or a nurse who's worked with MSF, who also does loads of really interesting talks about his work. So if you get the chance to see him talking, then I would definitely recommend that. I saw him do a talk a couple of years ago that while I was at uni, and we helped to organise it as part of a fundraiser, which was during the Ebola situation being ongoing. Struggling with words this morning, as I always do at this time. But my colleague who lent this to me is actually a friend of his, so she has read it and would say that it's a very good book, so at some point I'm going to read it. And I think it focuses on the Ebola outbreak and things that happened, and what it was like to work in that context. Then the other non-fiction that I've been reading is this little handy guide to tuberculosis, published by MSF. But I read everything that's relevant for my essay now, and then I was gutted to notice that it was published in 2008, and I think when I picked it up at the library, I forgot what year it was now, because technically we're not allowed to use anything that's over 10 years old, and that is really annoying, because 2008 doesn't really seem that long ago. But I guess I can just use it as background knowledge for myself. Then the final thing that I've been reading, and the only fictional thing, and the only thing that's relevant to Victober, is Our Mutual Friend. And the rest of this, I'm going to talk a bit about Our Mutual Friend, so just be aware that I might talk about the story if you don't know it. So Our Mutual Friend is a Dickens novel. It's Katie at Books and Things' favourite book, and she keeps mentioning it, and I read it years ago, and just the passion with which she describes it made me think, I'm going to return to that at some point. And I am listening to it on an audiobook narrated by David Timson, and it's just wonderful, and I'm loving it so much, and it makes every time that I'm walking to work or walking to get the train or so on, it just makes it a real pleasure, and I just don't want my journeys to end because I want to still be listening to the audiobook. I think I'm coming up for halfway through. I'm 15 hours into a 36-hour audiobook, and I should say this is a reread, and this is over 500 pages in the paper edition, the hardback, but hard copy that I have. It's over 500 pages, so I've met 2 of the challenges. I just need to listen to some of it by candlelight or something, and I'll be kind of halfway to Victober. But yeah, I picked out some things that I thought were interesting that I wanted to mention. So one thing that struck me particularly at the start of the book is how many of the characters are engaged in what I have written in my notes and called the business of death. So the book is not so much about death. Like, so far there hasn't been a lot of bereavement or a lot of personal, like close personal interaction with death and dying, but there have been a lot of people who work around the topic of death, which I find really interesting. So for instance, you've got three characters who come in very near the start, whose business is to find dead bodies and to work with dead bodies, in the sense that they are like moving them from the point of being dead and undiscovered into the kind of like official record system, but they themselves are quite shady characters. So I liked that kind of imagery, particularly there's a lot of association with the river, so there's like a lot of like mythological connotations there. So yeah, I like that. And then there's a lot of debate of like, oh, can you rob the dead? Can the dead own anything? Which comes in more like as the book goes on. This idea of like who can and can't have money, and can you have money after death, or can you have money that you were promised but never actually got? Things like that. Then we've got people like the police inspector, whose job is to like help with the identification of dead bodies, or like prosecute murderers and so on. So he's working around death quite a lot of his time. Like, he doesn't seem bothered by the concept of like dealing with another corpse. It's just like run of the mill for him. We've got people like Mortimer Lightwood and Eugene Rayburn that work in things like wills. So again, that's another aspect of the business of death, like making money out of people dying or preparing to die. And one of them, I can't remember which of them, has an office that overlooks a graveyard, which I thought was an interesting way of like place to put them in, and it talks about the impact that would have on their, like the boy who looks after the office, that he spends all of his days looking over a graveyard. Like the kind of emotional, psychological impact of being on your own all day in an office looking at gravestones. Then linking to the gravestones as well, there's another character whose surname is Headstone. Though so far I couldn't work out any other connection between him and death. Then there is a very interesting character who builds skeletons out of old bones, and he's like an expert in creating like bony reconstructions. That's a brilliant profession, like one of those professions that you would just never think of existing, and it just takes somebody like Dickens to take it out and turn it into this fascinating character who just works with puzzling together bones from all around like different countries and putting them into skeletons. That's great. Then there is this idea of a fortune that is built on dust, and the character that builds skeletons out of bones makes reference to the fact that a lot of bones turn up in dust. So the idea that part of their fortune is based on human remains that are somehow mixed in with all of this other rubbish. Yeah, I feel like that has some kind of like a symbolic importance in terms of like how the people are mixed in with their own rubbish. I need to wrap up quickly because I'm going to work soon. Then there is like Jenny Wren. She's a character that I'd forgotten about, but I love her so much. She's like the doll's dressmaker, and she talks about how she's making a full suit of mourning for one of her dresses, for one of her dolls, sorry. So it's like she's making the kind of the trappings of death, the way that the society responds to death, all has to be made, and that all makes a business for somebody. And then there's also Bella Wilfer, who she dresses in mourning for a husband that she never had, but but she was going to profit by a will, so she kind of would have been gaining something out of somebody's death when she didn't have that emotional connection, so she wouldn't have had like the grief almost. And that's something that I've seen in some other Victorian novels, this idea of like people benefiting from wills due to like distant relationships and so on, without it being a very personal level. So that was the business of death. The other aspect that I think is quite interesting is like there's a lot of references to literacy and what people do with literacy, and like why is it important, and what the value of it is, and how people can get it. yeah, I don't really have time to go into that too much. And also, like how people change, or do people change as they move between social spheres, and do people get better or worse depending on which people that they are around. So when you've got a character like Eugene Rayburn, who doesn't actually seem like that good of a guy, but then he also seems to, when he's in different situations, he kind of awakens his moral conscience slightly, and he actually talks about like putting himself in a space with moral influences, or he and like would discuss the idea of like having moral influences in their offices or in the people around them, and like how they interact with each other, impacting on their morality. We've got Bella Wilfer again. She changes a lot depending on where she is, and her character seems quite plastic, like quite moldable to the situation. And then we've got like the Boffins, who come into an amount of wealth, and then does it change who they are intrinsically, because it changes how they act. It means Mrs. Boffin like goes in for fashion, it's said, which is such an entertaining expression. But does it change like intrinsically like their characters? And then like we have another like Dickens social commentary thing where he talks about like this idea of podsnappery, and like the London social groups being like, I don't know, like they are following this like set rigid pattern of how they should behave. Anyway, I should be wrapping it up there. So thank you very much for watching, and I will speak to you again next week. And yeah, I'm enjoying Our Mutual Friend. I hope you're enjoying any books that you're reading for Victober, and speak to you soon.